Welcome to our Bible study this week. We are continuing in Matthew chapter 24, which, as we know from last week, deals fairly extensively with the end times and the return of Jesus Christ. Now, what I would like to do first of all is just to go over again some of the points we covered last week, the 8 signs that we dealt with regarding the birth pains towards the end of the age. So let's turn to our Bibles and let's have a look at that first of all. Now, as we noted, although they were general in nature and may well have happened continuously throughout history, certainly towards the end times, these 8 signs will become more and more prominent. So let's first of all just deal with that passage and read it again. I'm just going to read verses 4 to 8, and then we'll just comment on the 4 points we found there. So verses 4 to 8 are this: "Watch out that no one deceives you, for many will come in my name, saying, 'I am the Messiah,' and they will deceive many. You are going to hear of wars and rumors of wars. See that you're not alarmed, because these things must take place, but the end is not yet. For nation will rise up against nation, kingdom against kingdom. There will be famines and earthquakes in various places. All these are the beginning of birth pains." And you'll remember that Jesus likened this to the end of a pregnancy and the beginning of labor pains. So here are the first 4 signs that we find related in that passage. First of all, many will come claiming they are the Messiah or the Christ. This will become particularly noticeable in the last times, and we would place this in the tribulation period. The second sign we saw was that there will be many wars and even rumors of wars. So warfare, violence, and killing will multiply greatly in those times. Next, there are going to be famines. This is a natural outcome of war. Normally, agriculture is one of the first things to be destroyed, and so there will be famines, and then there will be many earthquakes. At that time, the earth will start to crumble, and as we said, there will be many earthquakes. Now we need to look at the second set of 4 signs. Now, these are given in verses 9 down to verse 14. But the key part is in verse 14, which starts off, "Then." So there's going to be a change. There'll be the general signs, which will become much more prominent, and then these distinct signs, which are definitely an indicator that the end times are close. Let's just read that. "Then they will hand you over to persecution. They will kill you. You will be hated by all nations because of my name. Many will take offense, betray one another, hate one another. Many false prophets will rise up and deceive many. And because lawlessness will multiply, the love of many will grow cold. But the one who endures to the end will be delivered. This good news of the kingdom will be proclaimed in all the world as a testimony to all nations, and then the end will come." So these more distinct signs of the end of the age and the return of the Lord are these 4. First of all, there will be bitter persecutions. There will be hatred, betrayal, and killing. Jesus expands on this in another part of his teachings. Secondly, there will be a predominance of false prophets. Now, we need to make a distinction. A false prophet is somewhat different from a false Messiah. A false prophet claims to speak for God, telling about things, and usually if we look at the Old Testament, we can find a clear description of how false prophets go about and how they behave. The third sign will be lawlessness and the rise of evil. A great movement of people doing their own thing and just ignoring law. And the fourth one and last one will be the proclamation of the gospel of the kingdom throughout the entire world. There'll be no place where it will not be proclaimed. Now, once we see all of these 8 coming, or we won't be here, the church won't be here, but once those 8 are predominant, then the second coming is close, and the labor pains are indicating that the birth is quite near. However, our focus today is going to be verse 15, but I would like to read verse 15 down to verse 22. Let's read that. So when you see the abomination that causes desolation, spoken of by Daniel the prophet standing in the holy place, let the reader understand. Then those in Judea must flee to the mountains. A man on the housetop must not come down to get things out of his house, and a man in the field must not go back to get his clothes. Woe to pregnant women and nursing mothers in those days! Pray that your escape may not be in the winter or on a Sabbath, for at that time there will be great tribulation, the kind that hasn't taken place from the beginning of the world until now, and never will again. Unless those days were limited, no one would survive. But those days will be limited because of the elect. Well, let's start off, and as I said, let's focus on verse 15. So when you see the abomination that causes desolation, spoken by Daniel the prophet standing in the holy place, then those in Judea must flee to the mountain tops. What is this abomination of desolation that Daniel speaks about? Because it's followed immediately by a warning that the people in Judea, or today we would call it Israel, the people in Israel are immediately to flee. They're not even to take time to gather some clothes or some food or anything out of the house. They're just to get going because dangerous times have arrived. We learn from other scriptures that this signals the beginning of the major part of the Great Tribulation. Jesus even calls that here, the Great Tribulation. That's in verse 21. It will be the worst time for humanity in all history, because Jesus declares there never was a time like that, and never again will there be a time like that. And may I just say, for those who say these things were achieved when Jerusalem was overrun by Titus in AD 70, well, we don't read anything like what is recorded for us in the book of Revelation and the astonishing events that will take place. Very clearly, I remind you that this refers to Israel. We looked at this last week in some of the references. It refers to Israel, first of all, because it mentions the Sabbath. It also mentions the abomination of desolation, which, as we shall see in a moment, must take place in the temple. Now, the temple doesn't exist at the moment. It was destroyed many years back, but it will be rebuilt, and it will take place in the temple, which of course is located in Jerusalem. So these prophecies are relating specifically to the people of Israel who will be living in the land at that time. John Walford, in his book on prophecy, says this event is so specific that it will be a signal to the Jews living in Israel at that time to flee to the mountains. Now, if you compare the parallel passage in Luke's Gospel, Luke chapter 21, verses 20 and 21, Luke also mentions that Jerusalem will be completely surrounded by armies. So there's going to be this dual sign, Jerusalem surrounded by armies, and the abomination of desolation taking place. So now for a moment, let's talk about this abomination of desolation. What could that be? What is it going to be? Well, it's mentioned 3 times in the book of Daniel. It's mentioned in chapter 9, verse 27, chapter 11, verse 31, and chapter 12, verse 11. Let's briefly look at each of those references and see what we can learn about this abomination of desolation. Chapter 9, verse 27. It's speaking about, first of all, a world ruler who will make some sort of agreement with the children, the people of Israel at that time. He will confirm a covenant with many for 7 years. In the midst of the 7 years, he will put an end to sacrifice and offering, and on a wing of the temple he will set up an abomination that causes desolation until the end that is decreed is poured out upon him. Now, very often later in the scriptures, particularly in the book of Revelation, it talks about this period of 7 years divided into 2 equal parts of 3.5 years. And it is the second 3.5 years that particularly interest us. Described in the book of Revelation, sometimes it's called times, a time and half a time, that is times 2, a time 3, and half a time, that's 3.5. It is also called 42 months. You'll know your arithmetic, that's 3.5 years, or 1,260 days, although there's also a mention of 1,290 days. But whatever, that is 3.5 years. This is the beginning of that 3.5 years of astonishing suffering, not only upon the children of Israel, but right throughout the entire world. What will happen is this particular world ruler who's made an agreement to give safety and peace to the people of Israel will break that agreement. He will attack Israel, surround them with mighty armies, and he will cause all of their sacrifices to cease. Now, let me just explain, that does require that the temple in Jerusalem needs to be rebuilt and all the sacrifices reinstituted. We believe that that will happen. It hasn't happened yet, but we believe that it will. That is part of Judaism. What will happen next is, having caused those sacrifices to cease and all Jewish observance to cease, he will commit the abomination of desolation, and we have a description later in history as to what that consists of. Let's now turn to chapter 11, verse 31. Chapter 11, verse 31. It says, "His armed forces will rise up to desecrate the temple fortress and will abolish the daily sacrifice. They will set up the abomination that causes desolation." So, as I mentioned, the daily sacrifices will be stopped and the abomination of desolation will be set up. Now, the last verse we have is chapter 12 and verse 11. "From the time that the daily sacrifice is abolished and the abomination that causes desolation is set up, there will be 1,290 days. That's the 3.5 years plus 1 month. We can deal with that later in a series of prophecy. It's just 1 month longer than the 3.5 years. Now, there is an incident in history that illustrates this. This event in history was regarding a man called Antiochus Epiphanes. Now, first of all, let's get our dates right here. Daniel was given this prophecy and he recorded it sometime around about 600 BC. Remember, if we're talking about BC, we've got to count backwards. So 500 BC is closer to us than 600 BC. So you go 600, 500, 400, 300, 200, 100, and then into the present era in which we live. So he wrote the book of Daniel in approximately 600 BC. I mentioned a moment ago this man called Antiochus Epiphanes, or his other name was Antiochus Epimanes, which was Antiochus the Mad. And indeed he was insane, an incredibly cruel man from Assyria, and he was quite insane, and the number of people he slaughtered ran to the hundreds of thousands. Now what he did was Antiochus Epiphanes invaded Israel, surrounded Jerusalem with armies. He caused all the Judaistic ceremonies and customs to cease. They couldn't offer their sacrifices, they couldn't circumcise their children, they couldn't observe the Sabbath. All of that was swept away. And what he did was an abomination to Jews. He sacrificed a pig on the altar, and then he set up a statue of the Greek god Zeus in one wing of the temple. Now we understand that that illustrates the abomination of desolation. Come forward. The time of Jesus when he made this prediction was somewhere around about 27 or 30 AD, long after Antiochus Epiphanes. So Jesus says it is still going to happen. So we have the prediction by Daniel, we have the illustration in history, Antiochus Epiphanes, we have the prophecy by Jesus, and it will occur sometime in the future. May I just say that there are some people who say that this occurred when the Roman armies attacked Jerusalem in AD 70 under the command of the general Titus, and Jerusalem was destroyed. Thousands and thousands of Jews were slaughtered, and they said this happened again at that time, and therefore this prophecy is fulfilled. I must just tell you that we disagree with that, because there was no abomination of desolation, there was no pig offered on the altar, and there wasn't an idol set up in the temple. You may recall I mentioned this earlier in the series, that in the sacking of Jerusalem, a soldier accidentally dropped his torch, that would be a stick, with some ignitable material, some tar, some oil on it. He dropped it and it set fire to the temple. The temple burnt down and the gold trickled in between all the various stones, and to get at them they broke the temple down, moved all those stones, and finally got to the gold. So that one part of the prophecy could not have been achieved during that time. So because of this, we say that it is still in the future. This prophecy still will occur in the future. And so what we believe is going to happen is there is going to be a final fulfillment. There will be a real world ruler. The world ruler will make peace with Israel for a 7-year period. But in the middle of it, in 3.5 years, he will break that. He will attack Israel. He will smash down Jerusalem. Thousands and thousands and thousands, if not millions of Jews will be pointlessly slaughtered. And then the abomination of desolation will take place. He again, we believe, will offer a pig on the altar and possibly set up an idol, and it could be a fulfillment of the verse in Thessalonians where he himself sits in the temple proclaiming that he is God. So all of these things lie in the future, and this is a description of the abomination of desolation of which Daniel spoke. So there's a warning by Jesus for the people at that time living in Israel, particularly in Jerusalem, that as soon as they see these things begin to take place, they're to flee out of Jerusalem. Verses 21 and 22 are remarkably important because it says, "For at that time there will be great tribulation." This is where we get the expression, the Great Tribulation. Now, we read a lot more about it in the book of Revelation. We believe from chapter 6 all the way through to chapter 19 is a foretelling of the events that will occur in the Great Tribulation, not just in Jerusalem and Israel, but throughout the entire world. And so what Jesus is saying is, here is the major sign which says this begins the Great Tribulation. At that time there will be the Great Tribulation, and here's how he describes it. He says, the kind that hasn't taken place from the beginning of the world until now and never will again. So he's saying these are the worst times that will ever occur in the history of the world. Now, I'm sure if you studied history at school or maybe at university, you'll be aware there have been some pretty dire times in the world's history. And this will be far, far worse than any of them. So much so, Jesus even says, unless those days were limited to the 3.5 years, no one would survive. So even in this time of God's wrath being poured out, as we learn in the book of Revelation, there is nonetheless with it God's mercy and grace, in that he has decreed that he will limit the time before mankind can obliterate itself. If God did not intervene, mankind would be totally annihilated. But those days will be limited because of the elect. The elect will be those people who will go into the millennium that immediately follows the return of Jesus Christ. So let's just summarize as to how far we have got so far. Jesus has given us 2 sets of 4 points. The first is a pretty general set where these signs will become more and more prominent as the days of the end of this era approach. And then he gave us another 4 that will definitely indicate that the days are getting extremely close, just like labor pains get more and more intense as the childbirth approaches. And then, of course, he gives us this one great sign, the abomination of desolation, that those living at the world in that time, those who have availability of Bibles, those who have read them will definitely know this is the sign of this great final period of 3.5 years of devastation upon the earth, and the coming of the Lord is now getting closer and closer and will only be 3.5 years away. However, I do need to remind you of this. These teachings tend to strike a fair amount of fear into the hearts and minds of well-meaning Christians. Let me just remind you, if we look carefully at the scriptures, and we dealt with this earlier, if we read carefully in 1 Thessalonians chapter 4, before this occurs, the Lord will descend not to the earth, but to the clouds. He will come at the sound of the great trumpet. The dead in Christ will rise, and those Christians still living will immediately be translated and gathered up to meet the Lord and the resurrected Christians in the air, and so forever they will be with the Lord. Now, the scriptures do tell us more about their future, but the point I want to make here is we do not believe that born-again Christians living in this era of the church of God's grace expressed towards Gentiles, we do not believe that they will go into this time of tribulation. We believe they will have been removed. God is not angry with Christians. God is not angry with the true church. He will remove them and protect them from the great wrath of his that will be poured out upon this earth. So please do be comforted by that. We're looking at things where the Lord has told us this is what he is going to do. These scriptures, no doubt, will be extremely vital for people living at that time, but we will not be here. We will certainly, one way or the other, be with the Lord in other places. Now, next week, we're going to pick up again. We're going to look at people claiming the Messiahs here, there, or everywhere, and we'll continue to look at the end times and the prophecies of Jesus regarding those events. Until then, may the Lord bless each one of you in the name of Jesus. Amen.